in the vast steppes of Central Asia, where the winds carve their own stories into the dust and the horizon stretches beyond the imagination of settled men, a boy was born who would one day bend half the known world to his will. The world remembers him as Genghis Khan, yet in the beginning he was merely Temujin, the son of a chieftain in a fragile confederation of tribes forever at war with themselves. His birth was not accompanied by prophecy, nor did empires tremble when he first opened his eyes, yet destiny, that invisible architect of human history, had already begun its work. The 13th century dawned upon a world divided. Kingdoms rose and fell like waves. China simmered in the east under the weight of dynastic decay. Persia brooded in the west. And in between lay an endless expanse of grassland where men lived by the bow, by the horse, and by the wind. It was a crucible that produced warriors, not scholars, raiders, not philosophers. But in that crucible emerged a mind of terrifying clarity. Temujin would not be content with survival. He would remake the very logic of survival itself. When his father was poisoned by rivals and his family abandoned to starvation, the boy learned his first and harshest lesson: loyalty without power is a prayer whispered into a storm. The world owed him nothing, and so he decided he would owe nothing to the world. Stripped of clan and status, he wandered the cold plains with his mother and brothers, scavenging roots, hunting rodents, watching the proud men who once followed his father now ride past him without a glance. Such humiliation either breaks the spirit or forges it into steel. In Temujin, it did the latter. As he grew, he came to see that the Mongol world was not doomed by weakness of body, but by the fragmentation of will. Tribe fought tribe, kin betrayed kin, and vengeance was the only enduring law. Temujin's genius was to recognize that unity, enforced through fear, bound by oath, could transform chaos into destiny. He began gathering followers not by birthright, but by merit, by loyalty, by a new idea of order. To men who had never known justice beyond revenge, he offered an audacious promise: a single nation under the eternal blue sky. The first to rally to him were outcasts, thieves, and dreamers, men who had lost everything except the instinct to follow strength. He rewarded courage, not lineage. In that radical meritocracy lay the seed of empire. Slowly the circles widened, alliances were sealed by marriages, and rival chieftains found themselves either absorbed or annihilated. Where once 100 banners fluttered in disunity, soon there was only one: the grey wolf upon the plain, the banner of Temujin. But to forge an empire is not merely to conquer others, it is to conquer oneself. Temujin's transformation into Genghis Khan, universal ruler, was not a single coronation, but a gradual transmutation of identity. When he gathered the tribes at the Onan River, the air itself seemed charged with a new mythology. He declared that the eternal sky had chosen him to bring order to the world. It was less a claim than a revelation. The tribes, wary of endless blood feuds, knelt, And thus a nation of herders became the foundation of the most explosive military force the planet had ever seen. Imagine it, a people who had no written language, no stone cities, no priesthood, yet within a generation they would topple dynasties that had endured for centuries. Genghis Khan understood the geometry of conquest in a way no sedentary ruler could. He wielded mobility as a weapon, discipline as religion, and communication as the lifeblood of power. His armies moved like the wind, fought like fire, and vanished like smoke. The bow of the Mongol archer was not merely a tool, it was an extension of the will of history itself. Each campaign was a test, not of brute force, but of precision. Scouts mapped the terrain with the memory of eagles. Spies infiltrated courts long before armies crossed borders. When the Mongols struck, it was never by chance. The speed of their cavalry, collapsed distances, the thunder of hooves preceded the silence of annihilation. To the cities of the Jin dynasty in northern China, to the kingdoms of Central Asia, the Mongol advance seemed less like an army than a natural disaster. Vast, merciless, and inevitable. And yet behind that devastation lay a profound rationality. Genghis Khan was not driven by cruelty for its own sake. He believed in terror as a language, a message that needed to be spoken once so that it never had to be spoken again. Cities that resisted were erased from maps. Those that surrendered were folded into his system, protected, taxed, and utilized. In this paradox lay his genius destruction in service of order, chaos as prelude to law. By the time his banners reached the edges of Persia, the world had begun to comprehend that a new axis of power had emerged. The Silk Road, that ancient artery connecting East and West, pulsed again, not with caravans of merchants, but with the thunder of Mongol hooves. Yet in that thunder there was also connection. Genghis Khan imposed a brutal peace, but a peace nonetheless. Under his rule, a merchant could travel from the Pacific to the Caspian under the protection of a single authority. For the first time in centuries, the great continents of Eurasia were knitted together through fear, yes, but also through function. Still, no empire built on conquest can escape the moral weight of its own creation. Genghis Khan's legacy is written not only in the chronicles of victory, but in the ashes of cities. Nishapur, Herat, Zhengdu, where tens of thousands perished. To his enemies, he was the scourge of God. To his people, the father of a nation. History rarely grants its heroes the comfort of purity. The same vision that unites can also destroy. Yet, through that duality runs a thread of inevitability. Humanity's drive to organize itself at ever greater scales, no matter the cost. Genghis Khan sensed that his power would outlive his flesh. He codified laws, the yasa, not as sacred scripture, but as pragmatic commandment. Discipline was divine, loyalty was holy, betrayal was unforgivable. These were the ethics of the steppe transmuted into the architecture of empire. Under his order, envoys were inviolate, trade was sacred, theft was punished without mercy, and religious tolerance was law. In a world accustomed to fanaticism, that tolerance was revolutionary. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and shamans prayed beneath the same sky, so long as they acknowledged the supremacy of the Khan. And yet, he never claimed divinity for himself. Where others built temples to their own glory, Genghis Khan built systems. His genius lay in administration as much as in war. He surrounded himself with men of talent from conquered lands, Chinese engineers, Persian scribes, Uyghur scholars. He understood that knowledge was power, and power had no homeland. The empire he crafted was not a mere extension of Mongol blood, but an organism of many races, tongues, and traditions, unified by discipline and fear. When he turned his eyes to the Khwarezm Empire, it was not out of madness but cold logic. The Shah of Khwarezm had slain his envoys, violating the sacred law of diplomacy. For Genghis Khan, this was not an insult, it was heresy against order. His response was apocalyptic. From the Hopial Mountains of Afghanistan to the deserts of Iran, cities that resisted were erased. Chronicles speak of rivers running red, of skies blackened by smoke. Yet even in that destruction, roads were laid, census taken, and posts established. Civilization, for him, began with submission. When the smoke of Khwarezm's ruin finally cleared, the world began to understand that a new map was being written, not on parchment, but on the earth itself. Armies once divided by mountains and deserts were now threads in a single design woven by the mind of one man. The Mongol Empire was no longer a dream. It was a geography of fear, an order stretching from the Yellow River to the Caspian Sea. In China, the Jin dynasty trembled. Behind their great wall, they had long believed that stone could stop destiny. Genghis Khan proved otherwise. His engineers, trained by captured Chinese masters, learned to hurl stones the size of oxen, to flood moats, to breach walls thought eternal. The siege of Zhengdu was not a battle. It was an earthquake. When the city fell, flames devoured palaces, and smoke turned noon into twilight. Yet out of that ruin, a new synthesis was born. Mongol pragmatism fused with Chinese administration. Steppe fury married to bureaucratic precision. The conqueror had learned to govern. He divided his empire with the instinct of a strategist and the vision of an architect. Relay stations dotted the land like nerves in a living body. Riders carried messages faster than any civilization before him. Justice, crude but certain, replaced the anarchy of tribal feud. In the courts of Persia, the markets of Samarkand, the temples of China, and the oases of the Tarim, one law echoed: the law of the Khan. The world had never been so connected, nor so disciplined by fear. And yet, amid this storm of conquest, Genghis Khan remained almost monastic in his habits. He dressed simply, ate sparingly, and slept in a felt tent, no grander than that of his soldiers. He distrusted luxury, for he knew it dulled the edge of empires. To his generals he would say, "The sky is wide, but only the disciplined reach its end." He understood that victory was a rhythm, that could never be broken. To stop expanding was to invite decay. He ruled through loyalty earned not by affection, but by awe. His generals, Subutai Jibi, Jochi Chagatai, were bound to him not as vassals, but as extensions of his will. He rewarded brilliance without regard to blood. A shepherd could rise above princes if his courage proved stronger. It was this meritocracy that made the Mongol host the most efficient war machine of its age. Each soldier knew that glory was attainable and death was honorable. They moved like a single organism, each heartbeat synchronized by command. The westward thrust continued. Across the Oxus, across the Caucasus, his armies swept like a tide. Cities fell in days that had taken centuries to build. European kings began to whisper of a horseman from the east who bore the wrath of heaven. But Genghis Khan's ambition was never mere destruction, it was integration. He believed the eternal sky demanded unity among the fractured peoples of earth. His empire, brutal as it was, became the first great experiment in global governance. Yet even conqueror's age, by the late 1220s, the fire that had consumed half the world began to flicker. The campaigns in Western China had drained his strength. The years of dust and battle had weathered his body, though not his mind. Still, he pressed on. The Tangut kingdom defied him one last time. He marched into its deserts with the relentlessness of fate itself. Their legend says he was thrown from his horse, wounded beyond recovery. The eternal sky had finally demanded its servant's rest. When he felt death approaching, Genghis Khan gave no speeches of sentiment. His thoughts were of continuity. He ordered that his empire be divided among his sons, yet bound by the unity of law. He warned them that complacency would dissolve what conquest had built. If you wish to know strength, he said, look to the steppe, not the palace. Then he asked to be buried in secret, beneath a plain where no monument would mark his grave. The location remains unknown, swallowed by the silence of the land that bore him. But though his body vanished, his presence did not. After his death, his descendants carried the flame farther, to the gates of Vienna, to the shores of the Adriatic, to the jungles of Vietnam. Kublai Khan would raise a new capital in China. Hulagu would reduce Baghdad to ash. The world trembled under the echo of a man who no longer lived. The Pax Mongolica, that strange piece of empire, settled over Eurasia. Roads were safe, trade flourished, cultures mingled. In the shadow of devastation, the seeds of a new interconnected world began to grow. Historians often ask, was Genghis Khan a destroyer or a creator? The answer, of course, is both and neither. He was an instrument of transformation. Civilizations are living organisms. They grow, decay, and are reborn. He was the catalyst of one such rebirth, tearing down the walls that separated East from West, barbarian from civilized, nomad from settler. His violence was immense, but so was his vision. In his wake came not only ashes, but networks, trade routes, diplomatic ties, cultural exchanges that would shape the centuries to come. To understand him is to confront the raw mechanics of history itself. He stands at that boundary where human ambition meets the impersonal currents of geography, technology, and need. The horse, the bow, the open plain, these were not just tools, they were extensions of an ecological niche that birthed a new world order. Genghis Khan was both product and producer of his environment, a creature of the steppe who became its prophet. And yet, beneath the myth, there was still a man, one who wept for his dead brother, who feared betrayal, who looked to the sky for signs of approval. In the chronicles preserved by his descendants, we glimpse fleeting moments of vulnerability, his grief, when Jochi's loyalty was questioned, his silence before battle, his reverence for the shaman who blessed his campaigns. These fragments remind us that even the architects of empire are bound by the same mortality that binds us all. The Mongol Empire eventually fractured, as all empires do. Distance eroded loyalty, ambition bred division. The sons of the conqueror quarreled, the unity of the Yasa faded, and new kingdoms rose from the carcass of the old. Yet the shockwave of Genghis Khan's life continued to ripple across continents. In Europe, maps changed to accommodate the East. In China, dynastic cycles absorbed Mongol rule into their logic. In the Islamic world, the trauma of conquest gave birth to new states, new art, new philosophy. Even chaos can be a midwife to creation. What then remains of him? Not his tomb, not his bones, not even the certainty of his face. What endures is the idea that history is never static, that the margins of the world can produce its masters. He reminds us that power often emerges from unexpected places, that the obscure can eclipse the mighty. In his rise from exile to emperor lies the eternal parable of humanity's capacity for reinvention. When we look upon the map today, the borders he redrew have long since changed. Nations have risen and fallen atop the ashes of his empire, yet the world he set in motion, a world of connected continents, global trade and cultural exchange, still bears his imprint. The highways of commerce that stretch from Beijing to Istanbul trace the ghost of his old Silk Road. The concept of universal law across vast diversity echoes his dream beneath the eternal sky. Even centuries after his death, the wind of the Mongol steppe still seems to whisper his name. The scholars who study his campaigns speak of logistics, of strategies, of armies that rode faster than any before them. Yet the truer story lies not in tactics, but in transformation. Before Genghis Khan, the world was a mosaic of isolated civilizations. Chinese, Persian, European, each bound by its own geography, its own gods. After him, that isolation was gone forever. The steppes had become a corridor, the sky itself a roof shared by all. He forced the continents to look at one another. From the Pacific shores of Cathay to the markets of Venice, merchants began to move under the same promise of passage. Ideas followed the caravans: silk for gold, gunpowder for parchment, algebra for astronomy. The Renaissance that later bloomed in Europe drew nourishment unseen but undeniable from the currents he had set in motion. History often forgets that destruction and creation are not opposites. They are phases of the same cosmic rhythm. To understand Genghis Khan is to understand that human history has always been a dance between chaos and order. He embodied both. Where others saw only tribes and borders, he saw patterns, networks of loyalty, systems of command, the possibility of one law stretching from sunrise to sunset. In that vision, he was not a barbarian, but a futurist born out of time. His empire was the first to function on a continental scale, a prototype of globalization driven not by trade but by conquest. Yet there is tragedy in such greatness. The same hand that unites also destroys. The same vision that uplifts also consumes. For every city illuminated by new roads and commerce, another was reduced to cinders. For every people granted stability, another was erased. The eternal sky, impartial and vast, demanded both gifts and sacrifices. And Genghis Khan, its chosen instrument, paid both. What we must not forget is that he sought not worship, but remembrance. He forbade the building of temples in his name. His tomb remains hidden because he wanted no monument greater than the steppe itself. To him, glory was not a statue, but a continuity of will, the unbroken line of purpose that stretches from one generation to the next. He knew that marble crumbles, but stories endure. And in the end, it is story that conquers time. Look at the pattern that followed him. Empires that claimed universality, the Ottomans, the British, the modern global order, all inherited in some distant way his logic, the fusion of diversity under a single system of exchange. Even the digital world, that invisible web binding our species today, echoes his old dream of instant communication. What were his couriers but the first nodes of a global network? What was his empire but a rehearsal for the world to come? But history does not moralize. It only remembers. And memory, like the steppe wind, is impartial, cold, clear, endless. So when we speak his name, we must do so with both awe and sobriety. He was not hero or villain, saint or demon. He was the embodiment of a human paradox, the will to order the world, even if one must burn it first. He reminds us that civilization is fragile. That greatness is born not from comfort, but from struggle, and that the line between creation and destruction is drawn by the trembling hand of necessity. In the chronicles of the Persian historians, there is a line written in ink that has outlasted the empires. It described, "When the world was disordered, the Lord of the age appeared." Perhaps that is how Genghis Khan saw himself, not as a tyrant, but as the instrument of restoration through the crucible of violence. Whether that belief was delusion or destiny is for eternity to decide. Yet the results are beyond dispute. He redrew the map of human possibility. When his armies finally ceased their march and the dust settled, the steppes fell silent once more. The horses grazed, the tents swayed, and the same stars looked down as they had before his birth. Only now the world beneath those stars was forever changed. The boundaries between civilizations had blurred, the roads were open, the idea of empire had been redefined, the horizon itself had expanded. And so we are left with a question that echoes through the corridors of history. What drives a man to seek dominion over the earth? Is it hunger, vengeance, destiny, or the ancient human desire to impose meaning upon chaos? In Genghis Khan, we see the answer that all great powers eventually give. It is not the land they crave, but the immortality of purpose. He rode not merely to conquer others, but to prove that will can triumph over circumstance, that the powerless can become the axis of the world. Centuries later, his empire is dust, but his lesson remains. The steppe still breathes his memory. The mountains still guard his secret grave. Travelers who cross Mongolia speak of a strange silence at dusk, as if the wind itself pauses to remember. And in that pause lies the echo of an idea older than nations, that history is not written by destiny, but by those who dare to claim it. So let us stand for a moment beneath the vast and endless sky he worshipped. Let us imagine the silhouette of a rider on the horizon, his cloak caught in the wind, his gaze fixed not on conquest, but on continuity. That rider is every empire that has ever risen, every dream that sought to master time itself. And as the sun sinks over the steppe, one truth remains immutable. The world is not conquered by strength alone, it is conquered by vision. And in that measure, under the eternal sky, Genghis Khan still rides.